Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is Shadi Atia, professor at Liège University in Belgium, and today's presentation is about systematic literature review. The presentation of today is part of a playlist on qualitative research methods, and previously I had a lecture about literature review. But today's presentation is different because it's a follow-up for the literature review presentation. Here we are talking about systematic literature review. Now, the audience of today's presentation is mainly researchers who are looking to conduct a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation or publishing a journal article. And the objective here is to help you with understanding what is a systematic review and how to conduct it from a methodological approach. Now, the content of today's presentation is an introduction on what is a systematic literature review, how to position yourself, what could be novel in your systematic review, what are the review protocol, how to extract data for your systematic literature review, how to assure quality and validation of your work, and finally how to synthesize the work and report it and write your final manuscript. Now, introduction, let's start with that. Well, from a methodological point of view, we have four families of research. Systematic literature review is mainly falling on the qualitative research side because it has a subjective nature by selecting certain articles or references and analyzing them in two depths. The big difference here that when we are saying systematic literature review, that we have a narrow scope of publications that are very well chosen. And what can make the systematic literature review fall between qualitative and quantitative research is that if you adopt a meta-analysis technique or a quantitative analytical technique that will make the paper falling between qualitative and quantitative. So it's very important that you define from the beginning, are you going to do a systematic literature review that is only analyzing the document and articles in a narrative descriptive way, analytical way, or are you going to involve meta-analysis, for example, or mathematical statistical approaches to analyze the data and correlate them. In this sense, it's important to position your literature review. Now, what is a systematic literature review? Well, it covers a long period trend with a large geographical scope, and it is time and cost effective, and it looks at high quality open access data. So this is simply the definition of a systematic literature review. It's definitely classified as a desk research work. It is falling under the content analysis family, and it is looking at terminologies and concepts. So it's very important to define it in this frame. Now, when do we do a systematic literature review? When should I say I can do it? Well, when should you do it? When you have many evidence-based studies that have been published in a certain domain. Well, we do systematic literature review only when there is already a body of knowledge and there is a confusion about certain aspects. Why should we conduct it? To answer a specific research question. And how can we conducting it? By defining a research strategy for articles and having inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria so that we can start to pick up the research that will fall within our investigation. Also, it's important to look at submitting a clear protocol or methodology when you are conducting a systematic literature review so that it can be easily reproduced, and you need to conduct a quality assessment of the studies that you are going to review and to make sure that these studies are already following best practices during their production, and you need to have a synthesis of the finding and explaining and providing insights based on that. So it's important to keep this into account when you look at a systematic literature review. Now comes the classical question of what is then the difference between a systematic literature review and between a classical literature review. Here is a dense table that has been developed previously, and you can see here that the literature review in general, it is introducing context or current thinking, often without a specific question, and it is more general and it covers several aspects of a topic. So here we are looking at a context-rich manuscript that is describing what has been published or what has been produced in a certain domain, while a systematic literature review is looking for a very precise research question to produce evidence to underpin a piece of research, to have a standalone piece of research that should be conducted prior to taking any further research. It can be, for example, looking at a generalization, can be done at the beginning of a PhD. So a systematic literature review is more specific, more narrow, more focused. It has a very specific research question, and we have less number of research. Now, when we also continue this comparison and we look at the classical literature review, here we are finding papers through fairly random process using searching only databases, and we are using gray literature in general. But when we do a systematic literature review, we are searching for several specified databases. We're looking, for example, specific PubMed, for example, using precise search terms, a similar systematic search for a gray literature, and sometimes it includes very specific terms and variables that we are looking at. So this is another importance for the difference. A classical literature review will be based on papers that are read, you take them home and you start to analyze the messages, while here we are looking at advanced data extraction techniques. We are trying to identify specific variables and we are tracing these variables, comparing them and trying to come up with a generalization. Also, something that is important to distinguish a literature review from a systematic literature review. A literature review will be anything up to 80 papers. So we are talking here about 80 papers or more. So your list of publication in a classical literature review will be high, around 80 plus, while a systematic literature review, it should never exceed 50 papers, and actually it's better to have only 10 or 12 papers, 15 papers maximum. So here you are very selective, you have 10 to 15 papers, very focused. Those papers have been written already in relation to the research topic you are investigating, because you are through reviewing those papers or the systematic review, you are trying to come up with common generalizations based on these papers. While in a literature review, you are exploring a new topic, for example, and you are still setting up the overall overview. One of the big important differences also between a literature review and a systematic literature review, in the literature review, the writer interprets the meaning of the results. The quality is found in the context richness. So the more you're explaining the context, the better and the more relevant is your literature review. While a systematic literature review, here we are having recognized referenced methods of data analysis. We use metadata analysis, for example. We include some techniques of rigor that are conducted in research to look at the strengths of the evidence, the quality of the evidence, and here we are looking at generalization. So this is also important to take into account. When we look at the literature review in general, here we have prose paper occasionally supported with diagrams. However, here we are using very specific tables that are comparatives in general. In the literature review, you can have a lot of visualizations, you can have diagrams, you can have network diagrams, you can have frequency diagrams, because you are looking at the literature in general. Here we are doing actually a comparative, very narrow comparative study for a certain specific topic, seeking to answer a question regarding a specific variable. So we want to know, for example, what is the common value of sugar levels in people who are having a pre-diabetes stage. So here we're looking very specific and very narrow research question, and the answer will be also the representation of data will be very specific in two tables. Also, another question here or difference between the literature review is that in the literature review, it is not suitable for short journal publications, and here we have actions or direction informed by the evidence from various drawn forms included in the paper. However, in a systematic literature review, it can be suitable for specialized journal publications, and here we are looking at actions and directions that are based on evidence from reviewed papers. So this is also very important. The quality of the research and articles that you are using in systematic literature review are very high and very solid, because you need to make sure that these journals are already peer-reviewed and they are following best practices. While in the literature review, you still can include reports, you can include gray literature, which makes it less strict in the selection. I hope by that you have an idea about the difference between a literature review and a systematic literature review, but allow me also to iterate on this side with another message. Well, the main difference between a literature review and the systematic literature review, if we look at this famous scheme of the levels of evidence, as you can see, the lowest level of evidence, this is the evidence that comes from expert opinion. This is the least important type of evidence we can look at, and therefore if you consult somebody, ask somebody about a topic and he or she gives you your opinion, this is the least level of evidence. Actually, the highest level of evidence is to conduct meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So it needs here to be experimental. And between this meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials and to the expert opinions, there are 5 levels or 6 levels of evidence-based quality. It moves from randomized controlled systematic systematic reviews of randomized control trials, individual randomized control trials, then category 3, systematic reviews of cohort studies or individual cohort studies, until we reach systematic reviews of case controls or case control studies, and then you go less with case studies or poor quality cohort or case study control studies, and finally the expert opinion. Now, if you ask me where should I classify the literature review and where should I classify a systematic literature review, a literature review can be standing up to level 4, which is simply case control. But anything higher than 4, the 3 or 2 or 1, this requires to be a systematic literature review. So the systematic literature review, again, is not done in a young field or done in a young research area. It has to be done already in a domain where publications are already available and that we have sufficient evidence about something, but there's a confusion about this evidence, and we are trying to do a systematic review to define what is common to generalize based on this review. So you can see the level of evidence of a systematic review is very high, while the level of evidence in a literature review is less. Now let's move to the second part of our presentation, which is positioning. How can I position myself while I'm conducting my systematic literature review? Well, allow me to explain what is positioning. It simply means coming or comparing the literature that was done by others and pointing out the things that your study does which was never done before. So this is very important to look at this, because when you are conducting a literature review, or a systematic literature review, you need to make sure that it was not done before, and you need to explore the existing literature, and you need to frame and justify the novel contribution of your systematic literature review according to existing literature. So positioning here looks at important aspects. So the ultimate aim of a systematic literature review is to provide background information about a phenomena, technology, problem, using existing relevant and reliable or credible literature. This is very important to take into account. Also, there will be always questions in your mind which you try to resolve by reading, and in the end you will still look for answers to your set of questions but find nothing that address your curiosity, and at that moment, once you have this situation, you can start your systematic literature review, and you need to have to read enough and check if you really read enough or not, and there's a possibility that you might have not read everything that there has been done or published in the literature, and that you miss some of the elements. So it's important to be skeptical, very attentive to the existing literature before conducting a literature review. Now, when we're conducting a systematic literature review, we need first of all to come up with this knowledge gap diagram that we use. We need to ask yourself, what is actually the research problem or the domain that I'm trying to answer? What is the critical discussion that has been done in this area? And then you need to identify a knowledge gap, and this knowledge gap will bring you to the research question, and from the research question you can define the novelty of your research and define the research question that will guide your systematic literature review. So this is the process how it goes. I need to have connection to existing body of literature and existing research labs and existing researchers. I know what they are doing, I can connect them, I can understand what they are doing, and I start to look at what is the past research, what could be future research direction going, and then you define your new research area where your systematic literature review will try to answer. And here it's very important to understand positioning in a different context. Allow me to move to an example for that. For example, when we look at positioning in the domain of the pizza industry, there's already a lot of existing pizza. Now, if you want to come up with a specific new pizza and to define the innovation, you need to ask yourself, what is the evolution of the different pizza types? Historically, we started, with margherita pizza, then we had the chicken pizza, the barbecue chicken, the pulled chicken. What's happening here is that you can see that chronologically, regarding the evolution of pizza, there's every time a new evolution. When I'm conducting a systematic literature review, I can use the same approach to trace and observe a certain phenomena, a certain situation, a certain evolution in a specific field, in a specific domain, and I can also do it geographically. I can start to say, okay, this pizza is in the southwest of the United States, this is in the California, this is in Central, this is in the West Coast, and so on. So you need to position the literature either chronologically by looking at history, who published about this topic, or which groups that we talked before, for example, researchers or research labs that talked about it chronologically, or how did it evolve geographically, in which cities, in which towns, in which countries, in which continents. This could be a way to position your research in regard to your systematic literature review, that you classify geographically or chronologically. Another important thing you need to come up when you're talking about you addressing or designing your systematic literature review, you need to address novelty, because you will be always asked what is novel about your systematic literature review. And in this sense, you need to make sure that actually you are reviewing the research that is falling on the category of advancing science and socially useful. Because if you look at the existing literature, a lot of the existing literature is applied research, which is very socially useful, but it is not advancing science. So this quadrant here, which includes applied research, commercial interest research, commercially funded research, that is, for example, having certain lobbying aspect or biases, that does not advance science. You need to avoid this type of literature. Also, you need to avoid this type of literature that is mainly looking at advancing science, but it is not socially useful. And also, you totally should avoid any research that is not socially useful and not advancing science by avoiding this whole quadrant. So it's important when you are categorizing and classifying the chosen research papers that you are going to review to make sure where they are falling in this quadrant, and as long as they are in the quadrant of socially useful research and advancing science, then you're on the right track. And you can use also this innovation quad that I developed previously, which helps researchers to define the novelty and the relevance of a scientific paper, for example, or a scientific work by classifying it into five levels. The first level is the research that is looking at evidence. It is evidence-based, and it's looking at solutions. And here we're looking to the level 1, which is new discoveries. The second level of research innovation is the research that is looking for new methods and techniques. Here, this research is seeking mainly to find solutions, and it is leaning more towards empirical research or applied research. Level 3, new creations. Here, this is research is more seeking evidence, and it is more seeking understanding. Level 4, which is less, it is research that is seeking new understanding. Case studies, for example. Here we are looking at research types of research that is looking for understanding and is more empirical. And finally, the least type of research that you should select for your systematic literature review is the research that is local and applied. Unless you are doing a systematic literature review that is local, that is applied. So if this is the scope from the beginning, then this would be the best type. So you need always to understand that when you are defining your selection and exclusion criteria for the choice of your references that you will read and analyze, you need to make sure what is the type of innovation that those papers are bringing, so that you make sure that you can group the papers in a corresponding way. Now let's move to a more practical side. How can I conduct and perform my review, and how can I adopt a systematic literature review protocol? Well, before starting, you have to ask yourself, how can I proceed? You need to formulate your research problem. You need to review the literature to make sure it has not been done before. And you need to have a form of hypothesis and give the review a title. This is the first thing to do. Next, after that, you need to ask yourself what I'm going to do with my protocol, how I can develop it. So you need to describe the steps before starting them of your systematic review. You have to know how and where are studies going to be found. You need to have an answer on what will be the criteria that I will use to include certain studies, exclude certain studies. One of the criteria was what I was talking with you about, the level of innovation, for example. It could be the theme itself, for example. You need also to define the methods used for the data analysis and the validity assessment. So it's very important to make sure that the papers that will be selected, that you have a kind of process or procedure that tests or measures the quality of these papers. Are those papers reproducible or not? And you need to make sure that you have the time available to conduct it, because this is important. And also need to make sure that this data is available. Now, the other aspect that you need to answer during the development of your protocol for the systematic literature review is to ask yourself why I'm doing it. So you need to ask yourself, what will be the readership of my systematic literature review? Who is the end reader? What is the journal name? What could be the potential authors? And you need, in this sense, to read the guide of publishing or the guides of reviewers, so that when you are developing your systematic literature review, you know it will end up in whom's hand, and you need, in this sense, also to ensure the reproducibility. So it's very important to take those aspects into account, describing the steps that you will conduct for the systematic review, and making sure who will read your work, and prepare your final manuscript to be accessible for those who will read it. Now, there is different also techniques that we use to analyze while we are conducting our systematic literature review, and here those analytical tools are very powerful. Well, we use research analytics and benchmarking tools that can be used to analyze the literature, and in this sense it is recommended to use specialized literature search and review tools such as Insights in Web of Science, PubMed, Scopus, or the Web of Science, because they have their own data sets and they have their own built-in search techniques, meaning that once you come up with your own keywords and your research question, you can use these databases, Scopus, Insights, PubMed, or Web of Science, and start to use your keywords as strings and start to search, so that you search within these databases, and it will facilitate your work, because then you will have different coverages and you can overlap the results and make sure that you are having the finest results. This is an example of a protocol that I used and I developed, and I advise you to develop a similar protocol and discuss it with your co-authors or with your peers or with your supervisors. So if you are doing a systematic literature review, you need to have a purpose. After the purpose, you need to have a very specific research question. You need to define your keywords, the synonyms of your keywords and your terms and the terminology. Then you need to define all the sources of digital libraries, for example, like I mentioned, PubMed, Web of Science, and so on. Then you need to have a list of these libraries or digital databases, and to make sure how you will have access to them or not. Then you have to define your research strings, what are the strings that you will use, and with, or, and so on. And you need to define inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, so that you reduce the noise and that you narrow the results up to, like I told you, never exceed 50 journals. This is already too much. You need to be around 10 to 20 articles that will be chosen, and once they are chosen after this search, you can start to analyze them. Some other tips for searching, how to find the sources. Well, search the terms used for the literature. Search should be clearly described with information on the relevance of the research question. Make a reference list of reviews captured during your research, and mention the searches with and without language restriction to estimate the number of paper excluded. So sometimes you can include the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and sometimes the exclusion criteria you can skip it, so that you have an idea, okay, your 10 or 15 chosen references are part of a larger pool. What is the size of that pool? So that you can say, we selected 15 papers out of, I don't know, 100 papers, or 150 or 1,000. So it's important to keep this into account. Now, how to select the references? Simply, you need to screen the titles and the abstracts, and you will be able to reject them, those who are not fulfilling your inclusion criteria. And also, you can have inclusion criteria that can be depending on the type of the publication preferred. Make a table of papers you will read in detail and those that you will be rejecting, and for sure keep a record of why it was included or rejected. So it's important when you are coming up with this table. This is an example. You can start to do an Excel sheet, for example, numbering the papers, the publication, the citation, the observations. You can start also to include the ones that are excluded and just give a kind of description why you are excluding them. Well, this is done with the protocol. Now we can move to the data extraction. By now we are already selected or chosen our 15 or 20 or 10 articles that we found in the literature that are already describing or talking about the problem or the variables that we want to study. Now we want to extract data in order to be able to compare, benchmark, and generalize. Here, this will be a bit subjective. We should never underestimate or forget that at the end of the day, qualitative research is subjective. What we need to do actually is to avoid bias and to prove that we avoided bias. And we try as much as possible objectify the subjectivity, but the subjectivity will be at the end there because we as humans at the end, we made a choice and we will analyze it according to our understanding. So it is necessary to summarize the findings of the studies reviewed in the form of tables or matrix. And here you need to include the references, the study parameters, the focus, the gap, and the findings. And the data extraction by the least two reviewers is important for establishing inter-rater reliability. So start to have other reviewers maybe involved and ask them to review the same paper. And this could be your co-authors, for example. And then you can come up with such a table, which could be an example of a literature review matrix, where you have the name of the reference, study parameters, what was the focus of the study, what are the gaps identified, what are the variables identified, and what is the findings of this study. Once you are done with this comparison of your 10 to 15 specifically and well-chosen articles, you can move now to another aspect of quality and validation. You can start now to perform some validation work. How you do that? First of all, you need to make sure that the original manuscript data are not created for a different purpose. So you have to check what are the quality and reproducibility measures that were integrated or respected in those chosen articles, and you need to report on them. And because actually the quality of the chosen article can influence the result, and you need to make sure that if they are reporting any protocols or any data sets, or they are citing or referring to other work within their work, you need to make sure that you can trace it and it's not restricted, it's not behind closed doors, so that you can check it and make sure that their data is already not outdated, it is available, so that you can go behind their conclusions and the reasons they came with these conclusions, so that you are sure that there is a transparency and that there is a certain reliability. So the data can be influenced during the collection or the coding or the processing, so you need to be able even to trace the sources of data and the experiments that were conducted by the authors of the chosen articles in your systematic reviews. Because like I told you, systematic reviews is a very high evidence type of evidence related publications. So it's very important that you are applying these quality measures for the sources that you are using. And once you find a paper that is not complying with the quality measures and you are having any doubts, you need to exclude it automatically from your systematic review. Now, for qualitative research, we said before it is subjective. So the quality of evaluation of the review has an impact of the conclusion. So try your best to avoid the bias, and you need to look at the context, to analysis, to your interpretation. If you have an ability to do a meta-analysis or to perform statistical analysis for the results and compare them to see the different means and so on, this could be very useful. And the types of bias that you could encounter while you're doing a systematic literature review could be the publication bias, the location bias, the citation bias, the language bias, or the outcome reporting bias. So these are all types of bias that can be influencing your total conclusion after reviewing those 10 to 20 selected articles. So you need to be very careful and double check and involve your whole reviewer teams or authors teams to make sure that you are providing reliable and truth-worthy conclusions. Now this step is done, the data is extracted, the data is analyzed, let's go write. Now, in order to write, you need to synthesize, you need to explain, you need to summarize. So there are 4 approaches depending on the question type of you are having. Either you can synthesize the data into a narrative approach, so thematically, or you do it in a categorical approach. You have clustering of the synthesis, you group them, or you do coding, so you have statistical synthesis with meta-analysis based on the content, or you can have meaning units, so you do data mining and you start your analysis. Well, this remains abstract, so it depends on your situation, and you need just to know that those are 4 techniques. You need to read about them to be able to say, okay, what type of reporting of the result? Am I going to do chronologically? Am I going to do statistical analysis to see the averages? Am I going to do categorical grouping? Depends on the situation. Now, when it comes to the visualization, you need to be creative, but you don't have much choices because most of the time it can be explanation diagrams or it could be tables. Most of the time, systematic reviews come up in those two formats. We don't have much flashy figures like we have in a literature review. In a literature review, you can make so much flashy visualizations of frequency, of network diagram, and so on. But in a systematic literature review, it will be either explanatory diagrams like those, or it will be simply data tables like that. Now, this is an example for writing a report, and I advise from your systematic literature review to write first a report, and this report can be exhaustive, and then you distill from this or extract from this report what is necessary for the article publication. So as you can see, the content of such a report could be having a title, executive summary, main context, background, review, question, review methods, and then result of the review, discussion, and conclusion. And when it comes to the review methods, you need to identification of the studies, the study selection, inclusion, and exclusion criteria, the data extraction, the quality assessment, and the data synthesis. So these are examples. This is an example for a report of a systematic literature review that you can develop, and in this sense, you can have unlimited number of pages, and then you publish it as a report. It could be restricted, and then from it, you start to write your article. This is an example of a systematic literature review, and as you can see, the title is very specific. We are talking here about ethnic differences in the relationship between insulin sensitivity and insulin response. So you can see from this systematic literature review that they are focusing on two variables only, and the whole study is focused on the work that has been in relation to those parameters, and they are reporting on the findings. However, in contrast, if we look to a similar research topic, same domain, same field, but it is a literature review. You see the title, Recent Advances in Our Understanding of Insulin Action and Insulin Resistance. Here we are looking at totally different type of paper. The paper here is not looking for a specific variable, it's looking at our understanding, and it's providing an overview on the advances. So here is a more general and more narrative approach and more overview kind of paper, while the first paper is more very specific, trying to find the differences between those two variables in according to the population type. So this is two examples. Just if you are asking what the difference, you can use them, read them, and put them always in front of you in case you get confused. I'm coming to the end of today's presentation. I have some takeaway messages for you before I leave you. Well, what is a systematic literature review? I tried to explain it today. I hope you are knowing that a systematic literature review is a narrow review of existing literature on a very precise topic to address a specific research question with a limited sample of references. You need to position yourself because positions requires years of experience to understand your field history and structural trends, and most of the time systematic literature review need to be conducted by experienced researchers or at least experienced co-authors, so that they are compensating for the lack of experience, for example, for early career researchers who are leading, for example, or a part of the authorship team. A protocol is very important and necessary to define the study design, the goals and the outcomes, and a systematic review cannot be validated without using quality assurance techniques to avoid bias and to be able to even check the data sources and the analysis conducted by the authors of the chosen articles. And for sure, systematic reviews can be reported through a narrative analysis or a meta-analysis. It's up to you to decide if you will move it, keep it qualitative, or you move it more on the side of quantitative, depending on the type of analysis that will be conducted. And finally, the essence of a systematic literature review is in its ability to generalize the outcomes and to understand or focus the outcomes based on the evidence that was found in several existing literature. And it's not about having here an overview or understanding. It's more about answering a specific question to generalize what is the best value or what are the parameters, values that we found in a specific context or a specific problem. By that, I end up today's presentation. I hope you watch the other videos on my playlist on qualitative literature review. Today's presentation was about systematic literature review. I wish you best of luck. Thank you very much.